Action.
I'm James LaFond. I've been told to say please subscribe to Hobo History because it's hard being a hobo out here. And we appreciate your support. Thank you. I try not to swear. The role in society that's currently filled by the police actually developed out of a bunch of different jobs that people had that were really nasty jobs in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s in North Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And they basically all revolved around slavery and crime. And North Africa, for instance, you had two slave populations. You had sub-Saharan Africans that were brought up from Senegal in Morocco. And there would be hundreds of thousands of these people. There would be a lot of them. And the men mostly served in the military as spearmen. And secondarily, they would serve as bullies and torturers for supervising, beating, and killing the European slaves. Okay, and now the European slaves were also in the army. They manned the guns and the cannons, but mostly they worked as house builders, ship builders. They worked in iron foundries. These were all 2 or 3 million of these people over 200 years were taken off of ships as far away as Iceland. There was actually a raid on Iceland where they gobbled up a bunch of people. And in the middle of the society were the dark-skinned Caucasian people, the Berbers and the Arabs, that ruled it. And they served in the third part of the military, which was the horsemen with the swords. So you have a three-armed military. You have spearmen on foot, they're all black. Horsemen with swords, they're all brown. Infantrymen with rifles and cannons, they're all white. So the Sultan, as long as he controls two groups, they can always put the other group in line. That's how he keeps people in line. He described his kingdom as a bag of rats. You had to keep shaking it up or one of the rats would chew a hole through it. So he had to keep his own people in line as well. There was a social status thing where the blacks were regarded as having less social status in North Africa than the Berbers and the Arabs. So it would be taboo for him to have his black spearmen kill any of his men from his social group that got out of line. And it would be too messy for him to do it. And it would get into too much power politics if he had this prince kill this prince. So what the Sultan employed, he would employ black wrestlers with clubs to take care of his white slaves, and they would have their feet inserted through a board, and then they would be turned upside down, and their feet would be beat with a club. If they needed to be killed, they would just pick them up and drop them on their head and break their neck. This has been described over and over again. That's the way they did it. So the black slaves served as the police for the white slaves there, and they used a peasel, which was a bull's member, to whip slaves to the auction block. They also served as the slave drivers. Now, the people that acted as the police upon the indigenous ruling class on behalf of the Sultan. Under Islam, Sultan means illegitimate ruler. He's not the caliph. He's not anointed. Okay, he just came to power through the military, so he's illegitimate. He's always got to play one side off against the other. The police he chose to use were the white slaves. In fact, if you were a rich Berber or Arab under the Sultan of Morocco and he wanted to have you beheaded, he would have an Englishman who was a well-known butcher from London who had somehow gotten kidnapped and sold into slavery in Morocco. He was in charge of chopping all the rich guys' heads off. So you could see how policing classically worked in the medieval world, where you have the black guys who aren't free, they're slaves, are used to beat and murder and police the white guys. And then the brown guys are used to take care of them. Okay. And then the white guys are used to bully them. So it's this merry-go-round of misery that they had going. It was a little bit more organized in England. What you had was the church warden. Then you would have a gaoler. A gaol. It's written Gaol. Gaol. It's pronounced jail, and it's often misspelled by the ancient sources as Goal. And I've not been able to determine whether or not the like soccer goal has anything to do with this. But they came into being, the soccer goal came into being as a goal long after slave catching had been the primary job of law enforcement for 300 or 400 years. Originally in England in the 1300s, with the poor laws there, you would be the slave of a whole village, and everybody would be in charge of watching you. But then they started, the Acts of Enclosure started in the 1500s, and they started kicking people off of the common lands where everybody could grow their crops and graze their stuff so that the rich guys could get it and enclose it behind a wall. Now, the people that drove the common people off, who acted as the police, were slaves. They, they were the slaves of the rich guys. And they would be armed and they would drive the common people off. So then the common people had to move elsewhere and they became poor and they starved. A lot of them died of starvation. And they would get rounded up and sold. And there was something called the Vagabond Act passed in 1572. So this made the job of kidnappers, gaolers, soul drivers, slave catchers, and pressmen. These were all things that they were called by themselves and other people. If the man holding the mic was beating me up and tying me up and dragging me off somewhere to work for no pay, I'd call him a kidnapper or a slave catcher, but he would call himself a pressman. Yeah, because he's pressing me into service for the good of all. Okay, so this is one of the sources that we have for modern policing. And the most reliable police officer and military officer of the early modern period is the sea captain. The sea captain is the law on his ship, whether it is a military ship or a civilian ship, a merchant ship. The captain will be the only one armed with guns, and he will have a sword. And then he will have three mates who will also be big, strong, heavily armed men. All of the sailors will be tiny, malnourished orphans or kidnapping victims who were grabbed as children. They were mostly teenagers. They're little guys. They're usually malnourished. Basically, you have a duelist with a gun and a sword, three NFL linebackers running this ship as the correction staff, because this ship is a prison. Every ship was a prison, and almost nobody served of their own free will. They were mostly pressed, particularly in the British Navy. 60 to 80% were pressed. And the people that they were beating up on were generally unarmed. Their knives weren't even allowed to have a point on them, the knives that they used on the rigging. And they were small little runts. Okay, so I mean, it was just really sad when you look at the disparity of force just built into who they were. And we'll see this later with the coal and iron police. But the Plantation America is basically founded by men who charter passage on a ship, and then when they land and are setting up their plantation, their law officer is the captain. And there might even be a Marine squad and a captain of Marines, like the Pilgrims had. Like Miles Standish was a captain of foot soldiers, not a ship's captain. That came with the Pilgrims. Captain James Smith was the enforcer for the Virginia Company at Jamestown. One of the first things James Smith did was sell his boy to Powhatan as a slave. And he cut a deal with him. He wanted the Powhatan Confederacy to act as, they didn't use the term police, wanted them to act as runaway catchers. So in Plantation America, for the first 100 years, if you were a guy that either got snagged from Africa or Ireland or England, and you were sold onto a plantation, and you ran away, Jason Momoa with a battle axe and a musket's waiting for you out in the woods, and he's going to bring you back to your master, and he's going to get some more gunpowder and shot and maybe a nice sharp kitchen knife for his wife when he brings you back to the master. So the American Indian warrior is one of the foundational characters for American policing. Their jobs were eventually taken over by frontiersmen and professional slave catchers who learned their trade from Indians, and even up till the eve of the Civil War, we're still using Delaware Indians as trackers to hunt you down. And these men used horses and dogs from an early time. And this is one reason why early modern people in the United States were not given shoes, because when you ran away, you would be barefoot, and then men in boots riding horses with big dogs would find you. Okay, so that's the way the Goler position developed in America out of the pressman. He would be the biggest guy in the town. There would be a small building that the local businessmen would put up, and it wouldn't hold very many people, maybe a dozen people at the most. It would be the jail or the gaol. And he would check in on the tavern and check in on the roads and check at the inn and see if he noticed anybody that didn't belong there, that was from out of town. If you were from out of town and you were not a wealthy man that owned a horse and had boots and a coat, he would ask for your freedom papers. And he might ask for your indented form, because if you were somebody that actually voluntarily or was forced to sign yourself into slavery, the form would be torn in half, and it would be signed and given to you when you were freed. But then you wouldn't be able to travel and leave the area unless you went to the magistrate and got freedom papers. So it was not legal to walk from Maryland to Delaware to New Jersey to Pennsylvania to New York. That was not legal in plantation era America. It was strictly against the law. So he would search you for your papers. If you had no papers, he would take you to the gaol, and then he would place an ad, whatever name you gave him, your description, whatever injuries, scars you had, what you were wearing, and every 3 months, he would auction off anybody who had not been redeemed. And if you handed over your papers and you were a 90-pound starving guy in bare feet, and he was a big brute with a club and 3 hound dogs and a horse, you might just decide to feed that paper to his dogs and sell you anyhow. Okay, that's the way it went, an awful lot. I found records of guys that had been captured and resold by the Goalers, who were the police, 5 times. One guy, I found him 5 times. That's how many times he had been monetized. But our term plantation, people think it's because you planted stuff there. That's not. The genesis of the term plantation comes from Ireland, where they took Scottish people that were loyal to England and they planted them in Ireland. And then they took those Irish people from that area and they sold them into the Caribbean. And they were called redlegs when they were sold into the Caribbean. There's still some of them surviving on islands down there. And so a plantation is a way that you take a wilderness or an enemy country and you get a bunch of poor people and you just put them there and you strand them there. And just by surviving, by growing crops, by cutting down the forest, by building houses, they're going to form a taxable economic base. So it's the way America, the wilderness, was conquered. They would just land there, they would drop a bunch of slaves there, and they would turn it into a tax base. So the plantation is still in operation in Louisiana. There is the Angola plantation. It is a prison, and it's still called a plantation. It's a place where you plant people for a profit. You make money off of what they do. Corrections is the only government racket that makes a profit, okay? And there's actually the private people have gotten into it. There's private prisons. So the prison has, as an antecedent, the plantation, and it also has the penitentiary, and it also has the workhouse. The jail was the goal, which is where runaways were put. So it's a temporary holding facility. We know that much about a jail. The workhouse and the penitentiary flow into each other. The workhouse, under the Quakers, becomes a house of penance, where somebody that was naughty and didn't listen to her father and didn't marry the guy that she wanted him to marry her daddy might sell her to the owner of a workhouse. And then whatever the owner bought her for, he'd mark her off as worth that many years of work, and then he'd work her for that long, and then maybe she could be released. There's things could, just like prison, just like a penitentiary, if you misbehave, time will be added. So the penitentiary comes from the house of penance, which comes from the workhouse, which was a place where unfree people labored, and they would usually be locked into a place that had the windows nailed shut. So your corrections officer comes from the gaoler, and your police officer comes from the gaoler, and he shares an origins with the bounty hunter and the Indian guide and the Indian scout and the sea captain and his mates. These were if your province was in turmoil and a ship showed up, even if it was just an English merchant ship, that thing had 18 guns on it, and it had 30 strong men on it, and 3 or 4 of them were killers, and they were armed to the teeth. They would sort it out for you. That's like a police force that just shows up. You're glad to see them. They're bringing stuff to trade, and they're going to be your local police force and maybe go out. A lot of slaves would try to run away on rowboats and canoes and little skiffs and stuff. Well, these guys were well suited to go get them, okay, because they're professional sailing men. And they were literally pirates. There was no distinction between a pirate, a buccaneer, a sailor. and of course, the low-down sailors were also unfree guys. Now, the police officer begins to be being used to keep public order in cities once the cities were designed for the rich people and their slaves. Once you worked your way free, they wanted you out. They wanted you gone. That's why hillbilly is a derisive term. Okay, the people that worked their way free and would run to the hills. Okay, they didn't have a choice because they couldn't work at a wage job. Okay? They had to go somewhere to make a living. They didn't want them back. The gaoler would take care of that because the hillbilly, even if he's free, son of a free man, if he comes wandering back into town, into civilized territory without freedom papers, they'll just auction him off. Pennsylvania used to auction people that owned grocery bills off every 3 months. They did this for like 100 years. Okay, so once you have a city that has been successful and now you start developing the steam engine and industry, you need a bunch of people in your city that can work. And only people who are going to work are poor people. Rich people aren't going to work. You're not going to do it. Okay, man in a wig with powdered cheeks. So they have to invite the people that are descendants of the people that that their ancestors enslaved to build these cities. They have to invite them back in. Okay, whatever their ethnicity is, whatever the race is, they have to invite them back in. So now the gaoler, the slave catcher, he's got to scale it up because now he's with these people all day. So police forces become like militias, only they're armed like officers. A military officer is, in the modern world, is never armed to attack the enemy, at least not until like the Vietnam War. That didn't start until you scaled down unit size. Military officer for 300 years was armed to shoot his own men in the back or stab his own men in the back. These are why he had the weapons he had. They weren't for fighting the enemy. They were for demanding obedience out of his soldiers who were slaves. And his sergeant was the warden in charge of that unit, in charge of that cell block, okay? The sergeants were like these 6-foot tall guys, giant dudes, and the regular dudes had to listen to them. And the sergeant's armed with an axe, okay? While these guys have muskets to shoot at the other poor guys. So you have to take that idea of the sergeant and the officer. He's armed to shoot people in the back, stab people in the back, hit them in the back of the head, and he's prepared to gang up on an individual like the pressman did, like the slave catcher did. You have to take that and make it a standing institution within your city to keep order amongst your poor guys who live a miserable life. They work hard, they don't make much money, and they will get drunk a lot. Okay. Now, in 1865, before the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment did not end slavery in the United States. It did not. Read the document. It's like 2 sentences. Okay? Read it. It says that no man will be enslaved except if he breaks the law. So slavery moved into the American prison system. Okay, right there. It's written in that document. But in Pennsylvania, they were ahead of that. As soon as that war was won in the winter of 64 and 65, in 1865, the Pennsylvania Assembly passed a law permitting another source for the modern police department. The private companies to draft their own laws and to hire their own police forces and arm them. Thus, you got the coal and iron police and the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons were like the primitive FBI. They could go anywhere in the country and kill you. They had a license to kill. Okay, they were just paid by rich dudes. That's it. The coal and iron police would in Pittsburgh area were 500 strong. These men were the size of modern NFL players. They were described as all being at least 6 feet tall, all being over 200 pounds. In an era when the average man was 5'7" and 140 pounds. Okay, these men were giants. They were armed with guns, hammers, clubs. They had horses to trample people with. They beat the women and children of the miners. They would sometimes beat them to death. The coal and iron police is the true direct origin of the modern police force as we know it. It is an instrument of terror. It is a small army of occupation which only works against a disarmed population. It's only good against a disarmed population. Any armed person has to be ganged up on with big numbers. The industrial age is over. It's been over for a while. All American industry has been outsourced to essentially slave plantations in other countries. So now you're in an information era society. So the old coal and iron police model no longer works. There's going to have to be a new and older model of policing that will be multifaceted. There are already, I think, 18 federal agencies with licenses to kill, with law enforcement powers in the United States. From those agencies, from the traditional police, and from the earlier sources, mercenaries, for instance, the oldest policemen were mercenaries. We are going to see that again. We saw that during Katrina in New Orleans. Mercenaries landed and they fought, okay, in Katrina, in New Orleans when Katrina hit. Mercenaries were used to put down civil unrest. During the Baltimore riots, myself and a man who I call Mescaline Franklin, who was like radical political punk rocker figure, were walking home 5 minutes after the curfew in Baltimore during the riots. 4 big military haircut goons that looked like middle linebackers, 4 of these big blonde buzz cut guys with BDUs with no insignia on them, military or law enforcement, just roll up and roll down the windows. And they were grinning. And they said, there's a curfew in place. And these guys were half my age and twice my size. And I said, yes, sir, absolutely, sir. We're on the way home, a little bit old, trouble in the hip. My friend's helping me. Okay. That's the future of police work. People are going to cheer because the pigs that have been harassed me 28 times in Baltimore City and Baltimore County, that these people are on the ropes and they're no longer the pillars of the community. They never were. They were just the biggest gang in town that were in charge of beating the crap out of the other gangs. Ultimately, they were there to make sure if I successfully defended myself, I would be dragged off and put in a cage. That's why they were ultimately there. In the meantime, they recreationally busied themselves with beating the crap out of random people, oftentimes for no reason at all. Okay, but it was practice for when they had to come after the law-abiding citizen to successfully defend himself against a criminal. So modern policing, the regular cops are going to devolve into mostly like public safety officers, which you already have in a lot of American cities. And then the real arrest, it's going to be like Camden, New Jersey, where you got U.S. Marshals doing the arrests. And you've got cops from other districts. I have a friend of mine whose nephew came home from school, and his sister was handcuffed in Pennsylvania by Baltimore County cops. Yeah. That had police powers in Pennsylvania. Harford County Police in Maryland have powers to arrest in Baltimore City if they get a warrant. Okay, so you're going to see cops from outside of your jurisdiction, which started with the Baltimore riots and the Ferguson riots. You're going to end up dealing with cops that aren't even from your jurisdiction. It's going to be part of the evolution of it. Eventually, you're going to be dealing with a local public safety officer who's handing you the paperwork and showing up with a clipboard, and he's got the camera on, and the federal cops and mercenaries behind him are hoping you light him up so they can light you up. Okay, that's eventually where it's going to end up going. It's going to be mercenary work. It's going to be elite federal task force. It's going to become more like Athenian and Egyptian policing, and you don't often get near Roman policing, where it was kind of like a community thing with aspects of the feud in it, you know, because that's a little bit ugly. And civilized modern people are such as these, they can't deal with that, you know. So you're going to, and in Baltimore, city I'm going back to tomorrow, they currently have a military drone on station at all times. In Baltimore County, I saw 5 drones in formation flying over the house I was staying in, okay, going to investigate a shooting that was about 1.5 miles away. That's where it's going. Eventually, the least empathetic police officer is going to be that robot. It's going to be that drone. So I predict that one day in the future, you're going to have drones that can zip tie you, and they'll just leave you, and then there'll be a collection patrol that will come and they'll pick you up. Okay, enjoy the future. I got a few more years of it left, but the rest of you are in for a ride. Is that all right? Okay. All right, so 29 minutes.